1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3.
The green one is on, the red one is off. You can switch it off or on. Yeah, when it's green, it's working. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Denis Maximov. I'm a curator of art and programming in here in Pushkin House, and welcome for those of you who are here for the first time and for the returning as well, guests and friends who are here. And it's my utmost pleasure today to welcome artists Julian Chehirian and Krasimira Butseva, who are the artists behind the pavilion of Bulgaria in Venice Biennale last year. They will speak about the pavilion quite a bit in a moment, and after we will also join them in conversation, but just a couple of words about them as well. Krasimira based in here in London and in Sofia as well, and she teaches, she's a senior lecturer at the London College of Communication, and also practicing artists as well. Voyages between Sofia and London. And Julian Chehirian is based in Philadelphia, where he is completing his PhD at Princeton University, focused on the institutions of the psychotherapy and basically the notion of them working with the sick people that are sometimes being referred to as artists in some way. And basically we met with Julian in the US initially. That's where the idea of this talk came about. I saw the pavilion myself and I was very startled by it. I would say I was startled by its four-dimensionality. I was startled by the research that went into it. The totality of the installation was incredibly interesting. And of course, they will speak in detail of how the pavilion looked like and what was the point of departure. But as a visitor, I could say it was quite a different project from anything else you would see in the biennial that year. And yeah, without the further ado, I'll give it floor to you guys, and we'll have a lot of images as well. And after the conversation, we'll open the floor to the questions, and yeah, we'll be able to dive into all the questions you'll have. Please give a round of applause to the guys.
Well, can we? Yes. Hi, everyone. Well, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. That was pretty much it. We're done here. Dennis, thank you so much for this very kind invitation. Am I speaking correctly into the microphone at the moment? It sounds okay? Great. Yeah, Dennis, thanks for having us. It's really a pleasure to be here and to just reflect a bit on a project that has been a big part of our lives and our practices for, I would say, the past 10 years.
Thanks, Julian, for always knowing who to thank. I just changed the slide to a picture of us. We thought that we'll start by giving credit to the other people in the collective who aren't with us, who very rarely are with us when we do a talk. I think it's always someone that does it, but never the whole collective. So this project was created by myself, Julian, and Lilia Topouzova, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, a filmmaker, an academic, and a writer, exploring the topic of the Bulgarian Gulag since 2004. And Vasil Vladimirov, who was the curator of the pavilion, who was also a part of this project from its very kind of a beginning and later kind of joined as a curator. And then we will kind of show you these images of the installation to give some context. Do you want to give some context?
Yeah, so context, very broadly, it's a multimedia installation, and the I think the way in which the Neighbours operates as an installation is maybe more accurately an expression of how we thought about an installation as in an exhibitionary form. And it's a multimedia installation, so there's video, there's sound, there's a kind of affective spatial organization. There is, as you will hear us talk about, a bit of a choreography that maybe draws a bit more on theater than the tradition of installation art.
And the installation deals with ideas of memory. How do we remember? How do we forget? How do we care and carry memory in our bodies, in ourselves? It focuses on the experiences, or the aftermath rather, of the political violence that took place in Bulgaria between 1946 to 1989. The research that's behind of this work took about how many years? 20 years? Like if we start from the first kind of a interview done by our collaborator, and then it kind of continued between time, and then later we met as a collective actually and started to work on this project. So the project is in essence an installation that recreates spaces that point to ways of remembering or verbalizing memory, or not being able to verbalize memory as a whole. And now we will go into our favorite part, which is the historical context of why we do the things that we do, like why is it important, why is it urgent that we work on this topic. I think we do a different version of this depending on the city where we do a talk, but ultimately we try to cover multiple areas of the history, both the one that took place during the communist period in Bulgaria, but also the one that took place just after the regime fell. Should we split that, or should I go?
You should go for it, and I'll chime in if necessary.
Okay. Starting from a kind of a brief history of these sites that we work with, or these spaces of violence. So basically in 1946, the regime started in Bulgaria, and 2 years later, the first forced labor camp kind of opened. The first labor camp was called Belene, and it's the longest kind of enduring camp that existed both in Bulgaria but also in the context of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. It only closed in 1986. There were like a few closures in between and reopenings. The people that were sent to these facilities were from sometimes very political backgrounds, so sometimes they associated with different leftist movements like anarchism, or like sometimes social democrats. Depending on the different periods, there were kind of different actions that were taken by the secret police in terms of the political kind of or apolitical involvement of people. In the 40s, when the camp system opened, it was mainly towards people who were aligned to kind of opposition movements, or people who were from like an agrarian kind of a background, who opposed to the newly established kind of rules of the nationalization of land, whose properties and land was taken, and who were protesting to one extent or another. Then in the 50s, it was more targeting people who are like from the new kind of a newly starting to established intelligentsia, so people who are young, often people who are artists or who are writers, who are the so-called hooligans, as the state security describes them in their files, in the archive. And then in the 60s and 70s, it was linked to people who were, for example, writing different manifestos and dispersing them, who are asking for different changes in the regime. And then in the 80s, the people sent to the camps were predominantly people from Muslim backgrounds, because there was this so-called revival process that took place in Bulgaria, which was an ethnic cleansing of the minorities of Bulgaria through displacing them or sending them to camps. Here you see a few images from these sites. This was my start of this research, going to these sites and taking these kind of very straight-on documentary photographs, thinking that maybe that could do something. And I feel like that existed within everyone's had in the collective about like why did we ended up doing an installation and how it moved from like photography or moved away from writing, because I think the three of us would position ourselves as academics to an extent or spend some time writing about the subject as an initial kind of a form. And then we kind of reached the idea of working with installation, but I think we'll add a little bit more about that. These are some images from the other kind of a prominent camp. There are far more camps than these two. These are the two which we worked with in relation to the site, but also to people who were sent to these spaces or the community that lived in the cities nearby. Łowicz opened in 1959 and closed in 1962. It was open only for 3 years, but this was a camp that was opened. The decision for this camp was taken to be opened by the Minister of Interior in Bulgaria, when all of the other camps were kind of orchestrated by the Soviet Union. So after Stalin's death, there was like a legislation for all the camps across the Eastern Bloc to close, which happened, but Bulgaria decided to kind of continue re-establishing more camps later. This specific site is completely missing from the archives. Any documentation about it has been completely kind of destroyed. So all that exists are several recorded testimonies, two of which our team has recorded. So going like forward in time to what happens in 1989, I'll try to be like really quick with the historical information, but I think it kind of sets a foundation of the project, or like why is it important for us or at large to work with the past and to dig into these histories. So what happened in the 90s was like several important events. One of them was a case was formed. Actually, a case against the perpetrators started. So people who were involved in the decision-making for opening the camps, the guards, they were all sent to court. There was an investigation against them. Simultaneously, there was a boom of memory, a memory boom that happened. So loads of memoirs by survivors were published. They were often self-published, if not all the time, in very small kind of runs.
And in the early 90s, there's a wave of sensational stories that emerge in the popular press about the kind of scandalous and newly revealed kind of allegations about what was taking place over the previous decades in the camps.
The BBC came to Bulgaria and created the first kind of a documentary about the political violence that took place. This was actually the first kind of a visual evidence. It's a kind of a documentary film, 40 minutes long, which features interviews with survivors alongside excavations of mass graves of like local kind of volunteers near these sites, and also like some scenes of protests. So it's a really kind of a great kind of a visual report of the things that were taking place, or like the attempts to care for memory. Another thing that happened in that year as well was that the archives were burned. So the building housing the archives of the secret police suddenly caught fire. And funnily enough, the order issued by the Minister of Interior at that time mentioning which specific files to be burned was forgotten to be destroyed. So it actually exists in the archive and it's possible to find it. So these are some kind of scans of this order. Going into detail of what specific, which specific cases should be destroyed, and like what should be kept or what should be kind of microfilmed so that it's preserved in different ways. So just before I go back, maybe just to kind of wrap up what was happening was that there were like all of these attempts to do something with memory. There was finally a space to feel safe to speak about memory and to speak about what happened. There was this case that started, there were these books that were being published, but nothing really happened after. The case against the perpetrators was discontinued due to statute of limitations 15 years later. It was never treated as a case that was about like about crimes against humanity. It was treated as a regular, ordinary, like legal case. So because there wasn't enough evidence to actually use due to different processes, like the destruction of the archives, the destruction of all of these materials that signified what actually took place, and later as of this other orchestrated kind of a process in which a team of forensic scientists were sent to a specific place mentioned by the survivors as a mass burial site. And they took samples, these forensic scientists. And later the samples didn't really prove anything because it turned out that they were actually sent to the wrong location on purpose. So there were like all of these processes happening to discredit the survivors' voices, to not be able to use them as testimony, as evidence in court, alongside the destruction of all of the documentation, proving like what had actually happened.
And the same official, Semerjiev is his name, who orchestrated the purging of the archive, which led to the destruction of some 40% of the archives of the secret police and the Ministry of the Interior. This same official actually was organizing the first Truth and Reconciliation Committee that formally invited survivors to come forward and give testimony.
Yeah, so the case never reached a verdict. No one was really ever kind of punished for anything that happened in the past. These books printed in small quantities kind of disappeared. They're really hard to find. They were never like republished. And then time simply kind of passed on without much happening. The only things that happened were local communities would organize self-led marches to some of these locations, or they would fund memorials, they would fund like monuments at specific like locations in the cities, but not more than that. And just, I think here I've put like for context, a few images that were actually preserved in the files of the secret police, featuring a few people that were detained in the 1958. These are some people are like arrested in Sofia because of the way they look, because of the clothes they wear. That's at least what the files claim, if you read them. On the back of the photographs, usually there's some short text describing the people, mainly describing the family they come from, whether they're political, kind of an engaged family or not. But I think in recent kind of years, working with some other kind of historians in Bulgaria, we've started to like look back to these images and look at other kind of files that have been forgotten to be destroyed, to kind of come to some idea of like not a resolution, but a suggestion that perhaps a lot of these people who are arrested, who are all like in their 20s, were arrested because of their kind of perhaps sexuality, rather than only like the way that they were dressed as described, because it was a period of time when there weren't as much kind of a politically organized collectives of people. That was like a few, kind of a decade earlier. And then these are just a few more documents describing the way they look. For example, one of these women was arrested because she wore ripped trousers and her hair was in a ponytail. There were, in this specific operation, there were more than 1,000 people arrested, and a number of them, undetermined, actually ended up in one of the camps. And then our maybe favorite part.
Yeah. The story of us working on this project has been often one of like rescue and recovery and remediation. This is an example of one of these moments that became so regular so as to almost become banal. Never banal enough to not give us goosebumps, though. This is when Lilia and Krasimira were walking in Sofia in 2023 and came across a dumpster that had somebody's personal archive, including documents that they had requested from the commission that administers the files of the former secret police. Maybe you can say more because this is your encounter.
Yeah, so we found out someone's archive. It was definitely coming from a single home. There were some letters, there were also like lots of documents, but there were also like loads of kind of poems or prose writings which were kind of dealing with political topics. They all kind of appeared to be from the past for sure, in terms of like the folders in which they were packed. And then later, a year later actually, I was walking home one evening and I saw this newspaper and I picked it up on the last picture. And when I reached home, I opened it and I saw that there were like pieces of paper tucked inside, which were all xerocopied like documents from someone's like secret file. After 2007, anyone can go to the declassified archives and request access to their file if there is one. So these looked like that because all the survivors I met and interviewed, they all kind of would pull a huge folder with xerocopied documents tracking like all of the like letters that someone has written about them, like the agents that followed them, and so on. So I found basically someone's personal documentation of the reason why they were actually arrested, written by the agent who was following them, next to the bin in my neighborhood. And I kept finding them, like every time I find more, and I think this slide or these images we often show to speak about how I think the project exists on a few registers. One is trying to work with archive of the secret police, but very cautiously, looking at it and like not really trusting it, but still learning about specific operations or things that happened at large. Then the second register is us trying to create this archive by interviewing people, by collecting these objects and making this installation. And maybe the third one is actually ending up to find the archive on the street or find it in the trash. And collecting it and trying to like preserve it rather than bring it anywhere further. I think you should speak now.
Yeah, so, okay, we're gonna take you to some of the spaces in which Lilia and Krasimira's and my own kind of research first unfolded. So I'll just speak kind of how in terms what my path into this work looked like. Back in 2013, 14, I did my first archival research in Bulgaria on the history of psychiatry during the state-socialist period, and I was especially interested in the ways in which psychiatry and psychotherapy had been instrumentalized or weaponized by the party. And some of my first oral history and ethnographic work was it was not sort of I think intended to immediately become an incredibly personal. Okay, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I was meeting with psychiatrists and the families of psychiatrists who had worked between the 1960s and the 1980s. I didn't quite realize how few degrees of separation there would be between those questions and people who had actually been repressed politically by the state. And so one of the first people who I interviewed was the wife and widow of a psychiatrist who had given testimony about the political abuse of psychiatry. And it turned out that she had been arrested and essentially sent into domestic exile back in the 1950s. And so when I sat with Kristina Mirenkova, we sat in a living room, and there was just a certain way in which our questions and the drift of some of the questions that were kind of alive and, talking about the past. Very soon she began to speak about her exile, about her father having to check in weekly to the police department in a small village where they were rehoused in the middle of winter. And documents began to emerge. She would go to a cabinet and pull out an envelope or a photograph and take it to the table. And part of the story about how Krasi and Lilia and I met was realizing that our research on the contemporary past in Bulgaria had often put us more fruitfully, not in archives, but actually in these very intimate, everyday spaces, these homes. And this became the central scene of our research. Lilia began working in 2004 on essentially meeting with survivors of political violence and forced labor, and Krasimira would do so in 2016. And I'll let Krasimira speak about where...
Speak about Petko, and you can speak about Petko. Yeah, so I think... So in 2016, in the summer, I spent a month in Lovech. Actually, my research focused predominantly on that city or on that camp rather than on Belene, which is the more prominent, that has much more kind of an information preserved or created for. I somehow got lucky to have like a contact with a local who was really passionate on helping me, who wasn't a historian, who didn't have a personal story, just wanted to understand what happened. Who knew everyone in the city technically. So he started to introduce me to these people, and they trusted me to welcome me in their homes. As Julian said, these interviews, these encounters, they'll happen in private spaces. So here, there are just a few images from the home of Pejko Pejkov, who is a survivor from Belene, from forced labor camp Belene. All the interviews, mine or Lily's or Julian, they would have the same kind of a rhetoric. You would arrive with a box of chocolates, you would bring cigarettes, you would bring like rakia or any alcohol that could be suggested beforehand. And you would sit and you will have a coffee, you would listen. Often you wouldn't really talk, you wouldn't really even ask a question. There is no need to ask questions. This is not really an interview. There is no way you could do the interview. It's more like this person maybe trusts you to speak, and then they speak for 2 hours. And that's it. Or maybe this person doesn't trust you to speak. So the interview starts backwards. You're being interviewed. You're being asked, who are you? Who is your mother? Who is your father? Who is your grandfather? Who is your great-great-grandfather? So that they know that I'm not the daughter or the granddaughter of an agent from the secret police, which they often thought I was, because they couldn't understand, why am I doing this? Why am I there? Why am I 22 years old, entering these homes, asking these questions? No one's paying me to do that. I don't have any funding. I'm barely able to afford to be there. And I just have this recorder and like this camera, and that's it. So often that will happen. And I think often, sometimes there wouldn't be a recording. There wouldn't be an interview really. It would be just this experience of being there, of making space, holding the space rather. This house though, very spectacular, very special for me, kind of triggered a lot of thoughts in me. I wrote this article about it, or about it and other places like it, thinking about how in the absence of a memorial, in the absence of a memorial museum, in the absence of any kind of memorialization in the state museums, perhaps memory has found a way to exist. Perhaps it's found a way to exist in the private space, in the home of someone, where they've started to make the museum. The museum, however, doesn't have opening hours. You can't really go enter it at any moment, but it exists, it's definitely there. These are images on the exterior of the house. It's not inside. The whole exterior of the house covered with these photographs of the people who Pejko Pejkov was sent together with to the camp. He was 17 years old when he decided that together with his best friends, we'll create an organization, we'll collect a few guns, a few rifles, and they will overthrow the regime. They'll do it. Because they were all from an agrarian, kind of agrarian families. They all grew up listening to their parents speak about the land, their relationship to the land, and later they saw how their families suffered when the land was taken away from them, from the regime. So they wrote a manifesto, they came up with a name, and they decided they'll do it, and they started to kind of organize meetings, invite other young people to these meetings. One of them, unfortunately, always an informer, went and spoke to the police, and then they were all arrested. And Pejko, in the interview I had with him, shares that he thinks because he was underage, he managed to survive. Otherwise, he suspected that they would have given him a death sentence instead of 17 years in several camps and prisons. This is inside of his house. He collects all kinds of objects, memorabilia, posters, busts, anything that you can imagine that is related to the Bulgarian National Agrarian Union, which was the reason why he was sent to the camp. Julian, do you want to speak about?
Yeah, this is our visit to this is a visit that I made to the home of Petko Gojski. who after 1989 became very involved in politics and was part of the, I guess, the House of Representatives, so to speak. And this was actually, I would say, meeting Petko Goisko for me was a very difficult and powerful experience. Not so much because he shared much about his experience. We actually spent remarkably little time on this particular visit talking about the past. We mostly just kind of went to check in on him and to bring him some wine and some cigarettes, and there was, I mean, Petko over the course of the previous 20 years had essentially built a museum in a tower above his house, 3 or 4 stories, and the museum tells about the kind of the late modern history of Bulgaria from the late Ottoman period up until the period of the 90s, and it includes a collection of essentially reenacted objects, some of them real, some of them not so much, although we wonder if it really matters, objects from his actual experience in Berene. So there was a wooden clog shoe with a small secret space in the heel where one could actually hide something like a ration of food or something else that one shouldn't have. But part of why we're kind of taking you through these photographs is that there is something about them that is very much kind of directed our thinking when we began to think about how is it possible to convey something about the unsaid, about the unspoken, about the silent, about the way in which the memories that were more than what could be spoken somehow were nonetheless live in the space when we would visit the homes of survivors. This is a memoir on the left by Petko Goiski, and on the right side is the little, he had actually essentially abdicated his own home upstairs to the next 2 generations of his family, and he was living in a very small room in the basement late in his life, in basically a makeshift one-room house of his that was, of course, full with memoirs and photographs and ephemera. But I want to kind of point attention to this strange origin story for a certain approach to working with the past that I think is very important for us. I was personally not present for the encounters that Lilia had and Krasi had with survivors, in the same way that Krasi was not present for Lilia's meetings, and Lilia was not present for mine or for Krasimira's. What we were left with was actually an audio archive of the oral histories that survivors, of course, were asked in the beginning whether they consented to the interviews being recorded. And what actually inhabits those recordings is both more and less than specific testimony about specific events that took place in the past. You hear in a certain recording the sound of a car driving by. You hear the sound of a cup being refilled with juice. You hear the conversation coming to a stop after a difficult question. You hear coffee being made in the background, a cell phone interrupting the conversation. You hear the sound of an elbow grazing the table and sometimes making contact with the microphone. And there was this kind of like vast but not visible ecology of things that were part of the environment and were part of the emotional space of this intersubjective environment. And so we began to wonder, is this not actually as important as the specific dates and events and names of comrades who were incarcerated? Isn't there actually something about the marginalization of these memories in these everyday spaces and moments that is actually not the form, it's the form in which this memory has been able to persist and survive in the period after 1989? And not only, because there were actually a significant degree of survivors had to remain silent for decades after they were released from the camps or from political prisons. And so it was these latencies that were reflected in what the microphone picked up that began some of our explorations about how is it possible to represent silence. And what we're seeing here is a document called Camp Project, started in 2017, and it's about 150 pages of meditations, reflections, and impossible and failed ideas about how to do the Neighbours. This is maybe another way to say, like, what is it like to have to work on an art project without having a studio?
Or money, or anything really.
Across
And
4
maybe
countries, in which neither of us are ever in the same country, because Krasi is here in London, Lilia is in Toronto, and I'm in Philadelphia or DC at the time. And it was actually, I mean, this project happened over Viber and Skype and WhatsApp and Google Docs for many years, from 2016 until 2022.
6 years.
6 years.
And then in 2022, we finally managed somehow to make it happen after plotting how to get money, how to relocate, how to pay ourselves, how to get out of work so we can actually work on this. After trying to plan, can we actually do this? Because I don't think we have the skills to do this. Like, we don't know how to do it. We had an idea, but the ideas were always like this, I mean, just the usual ambitious artistic plan that never makes sense. You have no idea how to start it, how to finish it, but it sounds so exciting and like worth risking your life. So I think that was kind of where we were, and we stayed in that place, but we learned a few things at least. So we moved to Sofia in 2022.
And we were able, incredibly serendipitously, to find a studio that had been a printing house, essentially like a paper-making printing company, in a building built in the 1930s. This is the parquet floor installed in the 1930s. And this printing house was in continuous operation between 1932, I believe, and the pandemic. That was the first time in which the space was vacated. And it was due to some outrageous circumstance that we had actually been able to ask to rent it for 7 months before it was demolished. It hasn't been demolished quite yet, but more on that later.
So we went there, but even before we went there, Julian was doing like, I mean, I think I have the crazy Excel sheets, and Julian has the crazy Pinterest boards. So this is a Pinterest board Julian has collected for, I don't know, 6 years, with like all kinds of objects from the internet that look cute, that maybe we can use, maybe we can find, maybe they'll find a home to the installation. And funnily, when I was looking back at this, I realized that a lot of them we actually have. We never really went back to this to be like fact-checking if we bought all of it, but it kind of happened. So we were like, we need to find objects. We need to make, like, maybe we didn't say that. We never said that. So I think the build up to this point was basically, we went to these homes of the survivors. We saw the spaces in which they inhabited, the memory inhabited them. It wasn't just these people. It was the memory that was all around, that was present in all of these artifacts. So we thought that working on such a project, working on such a topic that is often within like working with trauma, with something that's not material, it's very easy to kind of slip and go into a literal direction or a kind of an explicit. So we really kind of spent years thinking, how do we do that? And then we decided to make the homes.
Which required a lot of physical material. And let's see what's next. A lot of physical material that the actual city in Sofia seemed to just purge and exfoliate. If you spent time walking around the city, you would see these just like evictions of objects that were due to renovations, typically due to renovations. And so this is an example of just a deposit of an apartment that had been gutted for a renovation, and everything ends up on the sidewalk. The morning after, it won't be there anymore. So in this case, you rent a van and you just go get it, or even more simply, you get a dolly or you carry it
by hand. You don't rent a van. The van was much later.
That was for the bathtub and the refrigerators, plural, that we took from the street.
So we would walk on the streets, we would find these constellations of homes, we would collect them. Sometimes people would let us in the homes, like I mean, we spread the word, and whoever was getting a home would call us first before they call whoever else, and we'll go pick the objects, find a way to carry them like 10 floors down, put them in a van, and find a way to drive it to the studio and unload. I think the first time, this is like one of my favorite memories of how the first time we went to take apart a Soviet home, we were so excited that we found 2 working drills with us, and we went there only to understand that there were no drills, like nothing was with screws. There was like basically everything was just stapled. The furniture was stapled. There was no way you can put it to, like apart and back together.
Right. We got very excited about finding an enormous modular shelving unit, which the moment we took it apart, we realized that that's it. You can't put it back together. It's like IKEA, but without it. Yeah.
Another part of this was also our friends. They knew what we were looking for, so sometimes they would just bring stuff in front of the studio. Sometimes there would be just stuff in front of the door of the studio in the morning, or people would just send us random like pins on Google Maps and tell us there is the stove, it's in the mountain, but it's literally what you need. And then we would like spend like 2 hours trying to troubleshoot if it's worth going, how would we carry it, is that possible?
So the archive of paper, the paper trail of political violence accompanied this object trail that seemed to be as kind of unpredictably available as the documents that would somehow end up in the dumpsters.
There's a trigger warning here. Someone will hurt their hand in this moving image, but everyone kind of laughs, and we thought to leave it once again. Sometimes the objects, though, they won't really come only from the street or from the homes. They would begin to come from the sites of the camps, actually. We would start to travel there to record sound, to create videos, but we would also start to collect rocks and stones and water from the Danube, which, by the way, we preserved for 2 years, and then we brought it to Venice, and then we brought it back to Bulgaria. So we would collect all of these kind of natural elements, thinking about ideas of visualizing trauma, how maybe if we create these homes and we fill them with small traces of the natural kind of a world of the sites, maybe that would be a representation of how trauma hovers in someone's kind of a psyche, invisible to others, but very visible to them. So we collected a bunch of things, and then we just start to build, start to learn how to cut tiles, how to use all kinds of tools, bringing like everyone's parents and everyone who knew anything, or random people from the street, fixing something and commissioning them to come and cut like what, marble pieces, yeah. Okay,
we never knew how to do the thing, but we never questioned that this had to happen.
That's, I think, that's the best summarization. And then we start to make versions of these homes. These are like some of the early, very kind of experimental versions before we had furniture, or before we had the things where Julian compulsively would make these strange, wild constellations of objects, which...
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a certain way in which I like the way in which Krasi just spoke about this commingling of the natural world of the former campsites and the space of the homes that we conducted interviews in. Because between those two sites is the kind of spectrum of the way in which the past kind of leaks into the present, not always voluntarily, in the memories of those who we spoke with. And so what we wanted to create was a kind of psychic environment in which it was possible to constellate a set of associations, some of which were coming from selections from the interviews, some of which were coming from videos that we recorded in the former campsites, some of which were coming from sounds that we recorded in our own domestic spaces, or selections from the recorded interviews that were ambient sound and other sound that we composed. And so it was actually working with these assemblages that were not always objects that we began to kind of think about, if we gather all the shards, is it possible not to glue them back together in some recuperative manner, but is it possible to momentarily stabilize this very fleeting easily escaping quality of the traumatic memory and the historical memory in that sense. And maybe I can say a few words about the technology. This is where things get really manic and like kind of outrageous, but in a way that maybe isn't entirely apparent for the audience of the installation. So the installation spans 3 rooms. There is a...
Just skip there.
Yeah. There's a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen. And each space engages with a different style of remembering and forgetting. So if the living room engages with the testimonies of survivors like Petko Ogoyski, who were very public with, they wrote memoirs, they were activists. The bedroom space was one that worked with the testimonies of essentially first-time testimonies, with survivors who decided to share their past with us for the first time. And the kitchen worked with the testimony of individuals who either chose not to speak or were never able to. And so the way in which the technology functioned is we wanted to create a choreography of absence and presence that permitted for a durational exposure to not just these explicit moments of somebody sharing something with you, but also the moments that happen right after in which nothing is said. And so what functionally, technically happened is we used like 20 Raspberry Pis and like 5 wireless routers and probably 2,000 lines of code to orchestrate a bunch of analog devices like refrigerators, analog televisions, a sewing machine, a record player, to enter a coffee maker, to enter into dialogue with sound that was emitting from speakers. Some of them concealed within the space, others literally transducers, these kind of vibrating speakers embedded within radiators, embedded within furniture that would essentially become, they would channel the sound through the actual bodies of objects and furniture. And all of this was essentially arranged using smart home automation technology that made it possible to create something like a theater of latencies, of objects that are kind of affecting one another. And the last thing that I'll say on that maybe, and then I want to hear what Krasi will discover I have forgot to say about this. The last thing that I want to say is that there's a certain way in which there's a kind of a logic of what Theodor Reich, who is a student of Freud's, called free-floating attention. This is what the mind does when it's left to its own cascade of overlapping associations, in which it's possible to move not linearly, but sometimes laterally, sideways, and backwards from one piece of content to another, sometimes in a way that actually jumps over and underneath repressions.
That's very beautiful. I think I skipped very well to this point, and maybe I won't go back to the previous 3 million slides. But I think maybe a few things about the installation are that basically we thought to create a home, to invite people to enter a home. Each section of the installation lasts for about 5 minutes, and then another room is activated. So your body moves through space. In the same way, like we thought you could embody the space, in the same way that perhaps traumatic memory embodies the body or embodies spaces. You hear in the installation fragments of the interviews. Often these fragments are kind of very little or like everyday stories, very short stories. Very rarely they're like historical. They don't quote facts. They don't tell you about how big a specific location was, how many people were sent to a specific place. They tell you about the day when someone got home from the camp, the day they saw their family for the first time. They tell you about the food they ate for a year. In very few words. Sometimes the interview breaks, and I mention to the survivor that there is like a massive fly or like a bug on their shoulder, and I would kind of move it from them, and the interview breaks. Sometimes you hear like the cars too close to the microphone and the sound erupts. We thought that if the interviews become conversations, and if the space is a conversational space where there is always like 2 chairs or 2 sofas where you can always sit, the audience is invited to sit in the space, to occupy this living domestic space, and to almost be the interviewer, the listener, the person who is there to activate the memory by carrying it after leaving the space. You also see like a bunch of objects occupying these kind of vitrines or like domestic spaces that wouldn't really be there, placed in importance in the same way as you would go into a home. The home kind of begins to break. When you enter, you don't really notice initially that something is wrong, that there are things that shouldn't be there. And as you go kind of further and further in the installation, this kind of begins to happen. I think maybe we can just wrap it up because we can speak forever. Or I can show the GIF from Venice because it's funny.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and maybe then we.
And then we finish. I just skipped some parts here, but this is how the installation arrived. So fast forward to the future, to the present and now past. In the winter of 2023, we decided to apply for the Venice Biennale for the open code that the Bulgarian Ministry of Culture had published online. We knew that we had no chance. We were fully sure, no way this project gets selected. No matter how we write it, it's a political project. We can't hide how political it is. Even if we try to use the word communism like 3 times in like the whole kind of a description, it just won't work. Then suddenly we got invited to an interview and we were like, we know we write good and that we're all like insane on the same level, but they probably would just like do it for political reasons because they publish all of the people that have applied later on the internet. And then we went to this interview in absolute disbelief of this happening, but still excited that we got to an interview. I mean, that's great. And then we received this call on like the curator received the call. We were all again split in the 4 different countries. And then we heard that we were selected and we were like tremendously shocked. It was a really kind of a difficult and hardcore project to accomplish for the production time we had.
The phone call was essentially like, okay, you're doing the pavilion, you have 10 weeks.
Yeah, so the production time was, so we heard about being a part in January 2024. The pavilion opened in April, 20th of April was the opening. On the 1st of April, we arrived in Venice. And on the 25th of March, the installation left Sofia. So in essence, we actually also had to relocate from all of these cities and continents back to the same place where we can actually work on this. So it took us a few weeks. Like, we couldn't just do it instantly by receiving the call.
It's actually 6 weeks of production time, I think.
So we had 6 weeks of production time, a team that expanded. And I think someone said we were like a startup because what we did was we had people working on the project in different time zones so that the production was happening for 24 hours. Like, there was never a moment that no one was not working because there were people based in the US. So when we go to sleep with Julian at like around 3 in the morning, someone in the US will wake up and start to make the code. And then by the time one of our production art workers would wake up and go to the studio, this person would go to sleep. So it was kind of this. It was like really wild. These are just a few videos of things arriving. We shipped 2 tons to Venice from Sofia. And we really hoped to arrive as one piece and it won't like fall on its journey there. And then maybe I will kind of skip again to reach like maybe the slide with the team and then we finish.
I think maybe, we should definitely show that, but we also, I think we should...
Yeah. We're finishing, I promise. We include some things which maybe would be part of the questions, but we always like to show the expanded team. So how this project was like 3 people, and then it kind of grew, and then we put the slide over here, and then it kind of grew to more people who kind of joined for various reasons the project, and then it kind of continued to grow and grow, and then I was too tired to make more slides with more people, so it kind of ends on that note. But I think that's it, and it would be great to hear your thoughts and everyone else's thoughts. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this profound, actually, introduction to both the foundation of research of the project and its materialization. And there are, I think, a lot of thoughts coming up as soon as you are telling about both the process and the final result of it. For example, the exhibition that we have now at the moment also deals a lot with archive, historical memory, vernacular memory as well, or lost memories or speculative memories that are not restorable, basically, but it does mean that they're not meant to be thought about or not meant to be imagined, even though it would not be in accordance to the truth of the historical documents as we understand historical truth, but it does definitely, and I think what I felt in the pavilion as well, gives a credit to the affective history. And I think when you were speaking about the free-floating attention, in that sense, those apathenic connections in between of the objects as well that allow you to re-experience or process something that is basically ephemeral and could be only maybe experienced through literature. I think you did indeed put in front of yourself the most complicated task to show something like that through material installation. And out of, for example, again, the points of the experience in the pavilion, with the people I was, for example, in pavilion coming in, some of them felt uncomfortable, for example, from the smells. And that's actually one of maybe the first question I would ask you, whether it was intentional as well. And how did you actually deal as well with the point that you created not only a three-dimensional installation, it was more like a four-dimensional installation, because indeed those elements of the constellation of the objects being in dialogue with one another also created a certain environment that felt in a certain way because of the smell that you could feel from the furniture, because of the dust that you could feel as around, basically would not really understand whether it was intended to be in there or not, and that sort of space of confusion that it creates in that sense. So yeah, maybe that will be my first question and usage of my privilege of being a host.
I can say a bit, yeah. I think we really want to create an experience, I think, or like a space where you don't really know where you are. You don't really see the outside world. So we were really like, I think, working with creating darkness, with having like a space that's illuminated only by the lights within the rooms, for example, and then having all of these other elements to contribute to that. The smell, we really didn't know it smelled. Like people told us at the opening, and they kept telling us for the next like 8 months, we get it, like it smells. But because we spent so much time working inside of this space, for like the production in Venice, the production in Sofia in 2022, when we did this for 7 months, I think we kind of adapted to the point that to us it didn't really smell like anything.
I guess for better or for worse, can be difficult to smell your own house. Do you know what I mean?
So I think the smell was just the combination of all the things that we brought. So because the furniture was authentic, like we only constructed the kitchen. The kitchen was made out of, like, again, authentic doors and tiles, but it's hollow. Everything else is actually taken from the home, from someone's home, used for like X amount of years. And then all of that combined with all of the natural objects that we brought that were drying and changing like shape there.
And then there was, so we had to do 4 layers of blackout curtains, because the pavilion space actually has floor-to-ceiling windows across the long 18-meter wall. And so, yeah, we needed like 4 layers of blackout curtains to get it completely dark. And it turns out that the kind of like cream-colored interior curtains had this very grassy smell. And I think that was like the knockout punch. That was, I think, unexpected even for us, that there was something really meadow-like about the space.
I don't know if there's a picture of it. I'll just leave it here.
Another, I think, very interesting element of both the process of your work as well and the end result is the way you dealt with authorship as well, with the authorship of the project. Because actually, when I encountered the project, the point that actually the artist, curator, plus the source material as well of the project becomes sort of like this authorless, to some extent, collaboration and the process rather than the object. Maybe how did it, how sort of it emerged in a way in this way, and whether you thought about it as well in relation to the authorship, whether you were asked questions in that sense.
I think we're always asked questions, and I think in order to fight the idea of authorship, every time we do a talk, we change the order of our names. So every time we have to do something, we always put someone else first, so that we can destroy the idea of importance or who is important. And I think the authorship has always been shared. No one's ever thought that something is theirs. Like, for example, I've spent like months, and Julian has spent years listening to the interviews of Lilia and thinking about them, although none of us was there. None of us knows these people. And then I think it's the same for kind of every part of this project.
Yeah, and I think there's something just very, there's something very heavy about this research, and I think that for us it's felt in different moments like an honor, a burden, a responsibility to be in the privileged position of working with this testimony, and I think that has also made it feel like something that cannot be possessed, because I think that one of the bigger points of this work has been inviting others to bear witness to something that is a collective inheritance, and doing so in a way that also troubles the kind of partisan politics that have become a significant mediation of the way in which this memory is narrated or not.
I think I also add that one thing that we've spoken about many times, I just remembered it basically, about how like I've tried to work on this, Lilia has tried to work on this, you've tried to work on this individually through your own practice, and I think although we always say that no media is enough to do it, so that's why it's like with all of these different like ways of entry, but I think the main kind of take is probably that I don't think, and I think we don't think in plural, that a person can work on this on their own. We think that the only way possible to work with this is to be in a collective and to be in a place where this could be shared. And then I think the project itself, or the installation, we hope carries also this notion of how the only way we can think about this is to think together and to go through this process together as like a community, whether it's in the context of the local community or whether it's in the context of like a global community, in terms of how do you come to terms with memory and traumatic memory, how do you come to terms with silence, with histories that aren't even acknowledged, that exist on the periphery. Like these are kind of questions or topics that exist on like any kind of a frequency elsewhere as well. And I think we genuinely believe that it's only a collective labor that could do that.
And my last question before I will open the floor to the audience is in relation to the archive, actually. A lot of the work that you've done in preparation to the pavilion, both before knowing that pavilion would happen, actually, because the project itself was building up way, not purposefully to create a certain installation, but there was a research as an open end to some extent. It was an archival as well research. And archive, as you perfectly know, has two beginnings in itself, let's say, two notions, so two etymologies attached to it. It's both the beginning, the arche, and it's also an archon, it's also the presentation of power. It's what is exactly saved, what you also very interestingly showed through the story of the burned party headquarters and things that were washed out from that archive. So in that sense, the restorative part of the furniture somehow, and all of those ephemeral elements of memory that you reproduce somehow step in the place where the actual evidence, material evidence, is destroyed. And it just, again, that's more of a reaction, but the question comes, what happened actually to all of the objects that were in the pavilion, and what happens with that archive that you first of all already assembled, and do continue assembling it? And also future of this project, basically.
Right. So practically
We keep them.
we keep them.
They're safe.
Practically speaking, they're all in storage at the moment, and then this summer they will make a reappearance. Over time, we've realized that the role for this installation, it's not, as you mentioned, Dennis, this wasn't created for the purposes of the Biennale. It was created because we felt that there was a need for something like this to exist. And so the project has kind of gathered its manifest intention, I think, to become a sort of a gesture of a memorialization that has not been taken up by the Bulgarian state. And the form that takes is it assembles itself in different spaces and sites in different moments, and then it goes dormant, and then we hope it continues kind of coming awake again and somewhere else, and maybe for the reason that somebody else was needing a space like this.
Thank you so much. So now I'm turning to you, both actually digital audience and the physical audience. If you have questions, those of you who watch us online, please send the question into the question box. Anyone have a question, intervention?
Thank you so much. I was just going to ask, you were talking about earlier, historically, that post-Stalinism, there was kind of like a reaction from towards gulags there. But in Bulgaria, there seemed to be, you said there didn't seem to be a reaction towards closing them down, but to keep using them. So I was just going to ask, now since the fall of the USSR, is there still, maybe less repressively, but is there still a kind of latent kind of not accepting what happened and kind of still letting these memories keep going, like of repression, not actually answering them in the way that Bulgaria did back when Stalinism was rejected and all these gulags fell apart in other countries, other satellite states?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so like if we look at the history of the Soviet Union and the satellite republics, like after Stalin's death, there is like the closure, official closure. The repressions continue, of course, just in different ways. Often it would be prisons that would have a special wing used for political prisoners. That would happen, but the camps would close. And the main difference between the camps and the prisons would be that in prison you have a sentence. It has a duration. In the camp, you don't have a sentence. There's no duration. You don't know how long this continues. And often there's very little record of that happening, so you often just disappear. So in the context of Bulgaria, yeah, the Bulgarian Communist Party took in its own hands the situation, decided to open facilities and continue kind of doing like political violence. Sorry. And then in current times, there isn't much that happens. There used to be a memorial march that would happen in Lovech every year, but that was until a specific, like the head of the city, she changed, like it's a different person now, that's the mayor of the city. So it was a specific person kind of organizing that. That was one of the recurring acts of kind of caring for memory that existed. Outside of that, there are some monuments spread across the country, all privately funded. One in Sofia, privately funded, nothing state funded as a monument, even a small plaque anywhere. And this memory, like I think when we started to work on this topic, and I started to work on this topic on like whether it was the collective or me personally, whenever I'm in Bulgaria and I'm asked to speak about my work in television or on the radio, the questions are always like, but why should we care?
Right, and that moment of like, why are you digging into this past? Isn't it time for us to move on? It's really unsettling how often that utterance is followed by that same person off camera or off recorder tearing up and telling you about his uncle who was in the Belanet camp. It's just like, I wish I could be exaggerating this, but it's something that kept happening again and again and again, that there's this just kind of volatile proximity between the denial that this is something that needs to be processed and at the same time the visceral just closeness, of that this is something that is, unfortunately, most Bulgarians have some degree of separation, less than 3, with a family member of either within their family or somebody who's dear to them who has a family member who was affected by this history. And also, I just want to mention that for anyone who's wants to kind of do a dive on this history of the Bulgarian Gulag, there will finally be an academic monograph by our collaborator Lilia that is coming out on July 15th with Cornell University Press on silencing the history and legacy of the Bulgarian Gulag. So I'm very excited to finally have my hands on this book personally. So yeah, just wanted to mention about that. Thanks for the question.
Hello. Thank you. Благодаря. Thank you so much for this. And I'm curious, how did you keep from crying when you were interviewing the people? And then, I don't know, I even wonder, is it respectful to cry? Because you also want to honor their story without, I don't know, just overwriting it with your emotion. And then just a practical question, where is that monument in Sofia? I'm curious.
The monument is next to the National Palace of Culture, NDK. It's like, there's a small church on one side, like very small, and next to it there's like this black marble wall. On it there are names engraved by people who were sent to, who were, for example, some of the victims from the first People's Court, second People's Court, and then some people who were, like, for example, famous writers or like kind of a well-known dissidents. It's not the full kind of a list of people. This was built in 2004, and it was privately funded by the families of the victims to be constructed. And then back to the first question. I think when I was interviewing the survivors, I will just mirror them. Often I wouldn't really, I don't think I will really cry during the interview, because often I'll just chain smoke through the whole time, you know? Like I'll do the breathing exercise, I'll do it hard, and they'll chain smoke too. And then often we would also drink, because that would be how we would be able to kind of cope with the moment, survive the moment. I will cry after, when I go to the hotel room, to the room, wherever, and then I will cry for years in the studio. I will cry like every time I listen to these interviews. And then eventually I would write a manifesto for myself, which would be every 10 minutes I take a break. Every 1 hour I go outside and I come back. Every time when I start to feel like pain in my chest, I will play loud any music. So I ground myself to this moment, so I'm not in the interview, or I don't know.
And just the context for what Krasi is saying is that Krasi in particular was not listening to a given interview 20 times. She was scrolling through microseconds of the same section of it 70 times in order to select the right portion and clean up some of the noise or make a selection. So there's a sort of granular violence, unfortunately, to that encounter. So I would often I would walk into our studio and see Krasi just editing with tears on her face, which was really difficult.
I think often I'll just cry and work, like, because, I mean, it affects me, but I have to do this and I want to do this. And I think I thought about this, like, I think a few months ago, when I was talking about this project in some other context, how every room that I've lived in the past 10 years, these voices have been in the room with me. Everywhere I've moved, to any city or a country or a flat, I've always listened to these interviews. I've been listening to them for 10 years, and they don't affect me less. Really, they don't affect me less. I know, actually we know by heart some of the parts of the interviews, because in order to run technical checks of the installation and to see if the whole sequence makes sense, if every audio plays in the right moment, doesn't overlap with another interview, we had to really sit and listen from start to beginning. There was no way we can listen to this section and the installation is hour and a half. And yesterday, actually, we had a call with our collaborator, remembering how me and her stood in the pavilion a few days before the opening and listened to the installation from 10 in the morning until 7 p.m. because we just had to do little changes of like the code and then listen to it again until we reached the same same place. And then we just spoke about how we kind of blacked out after like 7 p.m. Like I have no recollection of the day after being in the pavilion. So it's been hard, I think, because although it's not our pain, it's not our trauma, and we're not playing the comparison game of suffering, it's still a lot, because I feel like this project is definitely our lives, 100% our lives. It's not something we do and then we just continue. I think we never continue. We always kind of think that we're almost getting out, we're about to do the next thing. And no, just go back to it.
I have a question around because it's a lot about memory archive and the things that's changing, right? So I'm wondering with the let's say youth in Bulgaria, is this something that how was it received in general, and then maybe the youths, and then how I'm thinking this kind of thing would not make it into a national narrative, but then because all the archive has been destroyed, what's the feeling like in a way? I don't know if I'm making sense of this question. Yeah.
You can speak because I just spoke.
So in 2022, when we staged the Neighbours in the studio space that you saw, I think one of the things that we felt was most important was to organize, essentially to invite high school students from around the country and to organize transportation so that any teacher that wanted to bring their class to the installation could do so. And we did definitely more than a dozen tours, probably closer to 20 different classes. I don't remember the numbers, but it was really, it was kind of uncanny we would kind of give broad historical framing of why, what happened, why are we doing this, why are you here right now? And then we would invite them to just spend time in the installation as it unfolded. And we would kind of walk around and just be available in case anybody wanted to chat. We would also let them know that if anybody was feeling overwhelmed, that they really should take some time outside. And many students, a handful definitely needed to step away from the space, but others began speaking about how, this space is exactly like my grandmother's apartment. And they would just be met with, I think, this simultaneous familiarity of the objects and the general quality, just vibe of the space, and also something that maybe they hadn't put words to yet or at that point, but they knew. It was just this moment of recognition.
I think there was one of the classes that came. It was from history, kind of like a school that has a profile in history. And the class was predominantly of girls. So they were looking at the installation, and we've put at specific points objects that would be associated with women, like rose for hair or lipstick, whatever. And then, although there are very few survivors that are women who have decided to speak, whose interviews were actually recorded, much more than the ones that actually ended up at the camps. So these girls were gathered around these objects, the makeup. And there was some interview playing. It wasn't the voice of a woman, it was a voice of a man. And they were all looking at them and being a bit suspicious or a bit curious. They said, why is there objects here of women? Were there women in the camps? And then we told them, yeah, there were women in the camps. There were women camps and camps for men. And they were really, really shocked, really emotionally shocked from this. And this learning happened through the objects. There was no interview playing really. There was nothing really happening to activate that. And I think a lot of them started to also remember what their grandparents would tell them about the regime, or what their parents told them about the regime. And then of course we'll find ourselves in the very kind of a typical Bulgarian, or like I could say Eastern European space, where things exist only in polarities. They don't exist anywhere in between. It's either we're anti-communist and this was the worst regime because there was a person that was in the camps, or it's this was the best time and we should go back because the food was cheap, people are happier and so on, and that would be always said from the side of a family that was affiliated with the party. So suddenly all of these kind of teenagers would share these stories, but they wouldn't really share them with trust. They would just be like, oh, I've heard this, but actually I don't know anything about that. That's just one story I've heard. It was very, I think, interesting to spend time with them. I think, I don't know what they know, like if they know anything. There is a little bit in the history books that has been included in the past few years for the first time. There is one lesson about the camps in the history books for 10th grade. It features a film I made with one survivor as part of the homework materials. There's another lesson which calls the start of the regime occupation, which took like good 30 years for this word to appear, and not, what's the other word they use? Like the Soviet Union freeing Bulgaria.
Occupation.
Liberation.
Yeah.
It used to be liberation. But it's really like not fully fledged because this narrative still doesn't exist in national kind of a history of like national identity. It's not anywhere in the museums. We thought that basically this project being selected for the Biennale is probably the biggest move of the state that they could do, although we made the project, it's not really their move, and their move could be again motivated by super specific political reasons related to the timing of the selection of the project. But at the end of the day, it kind of went, it wasn't censored. We were worried it would be censored before it went, during its time there, that something could always kind of happen, that we could get like a low case. Like we heard plenty of stories of stuff that could happen, and we were like very ready about it to happen.
Yeah, maybe just one question that connects a little bit to that, because I was just thinking about the Biennale as also, of course, a place with all these national pavilions, quite a visible geopolitical kind of mirror in a way, but maybe not at all a mirror. So then I was curious, like the resonance on the national level you spoke about, but how about international level, or maybe even EU level, or how is that? Can you say something about that?
Do you want to say something, or should I say something? Okay. So the project was actually much more critically acclaimed or accepted or celebrated in like international media than Bulgarian media. There was barely any coverage about the project in Bulgaria. Like the coverage happened only for journalists that already, for example, knew me and my practice, or knew us from before, from the first edition of the project. And that was it basically. There was not even one article. It was like interviews in Bulgaria. When in the international media, it was included, for example, in the first kind of lists that came out in the first kind of a pre-opening week about top pavilions to visit. Maybe you can go to that slide if you want. We included a slide for the international media. We never had time. And we actually want to include a bit more slides, by the way. We spent the whole morning removing things. So basically the Guardian came to Sofia, they came to our studio. We went with this journalist, Kate Connolly, to one of the sites of the camps, and we introduced her to one survivor that was still alive and the daughter of another survivor, and she wrote a piece about the work. And then Laura Cumming came to the pre-opening and spent a long time in the pavilion. She's like a British art critic. And we, at the point, we were like quite worried that she was inside the pavilion for more than 20 minutes, knowing that these type of people wouldn't have that much time. So like our PR recommended that we don't go in, like we leave her to have her time. But we were like, oh my God, is she okay? It's like very dark, maybe she tripped, I don't know, we should just go and check. so we just entered to see if she was okay. She was okay, she was there. She was crying. And then she was, a lot of people would end up being there and crying and apologizing that they didn't know. And we would tell them that we also didn't know. Like I also didn't know. I learned by chance. I learned when I had moved to the UK. When I had graduated from my BA, very randomly I learned about the political violence. I never heard about it. I was raised in Bulgaria, studied in Bulgaria. My whole childhood identity was formed there. I never heard about it. And then this kept going on for like the next, I don't know how many months was this been, 8 months, 6 months. It was really like some journalists from like the Swedish national radio came, did like a whole episode about us in like the national radio. And then there were like a few reviews also written and published in some like printed publications. So it was actually really kind of picked up and resonating. I feel like what helped this project to resonate, or why the project resonated, was partially also because of the topic of the Biennale and what the other pavilions were also doing. At this specific year, there happened to be, in my opinion, a lot of work that dealt with archives, that dealt with silent histories or with history in general, that wasn't like the national history of a specific country. So I felt like that was the response predominantly to many pavilions for this topic. And I think that also kind of helped, I think, the project to be understood widely, I feel.
One question I think we have from online, just a second. So Keva Kursakov asks, thank you so much for presenting, and why should we care? What keeps you moving through the anti-intellectualism and downright hostility that often comes up when trying to bring empathy into or expand on Bulgarian cultural identity?
I would love if you could read it again, because I loved the question. I want to hear it one more time.
Why should we care?
Brutal opening, yeah.
But that's in parentheses.
Yeah.
What keeps you moving through the anti-intellectualism and downright hostility that often comes up when trying to bring empathy into and expand on Bulgarian cultural identity?
The return of the repressed. It's even in the hostility, there is a kind of passion that seems to continually sort of re-electrify the field of what matters. I think that maybe the point at which we can stop working on this is when there is actually a shrug. But the thing is that there rarely is a shrug. It's usually this polarity between somebody either being so moved that they want to share with you that one of their relatives was arrested, or was in the camps, or was in a political prison, or on the other side, there's somebody that wants to argue with you, that these people were actually criminals or hooligans, and then sometimes those people actually, it turns out that they have a really interesting and complicated family story as well. And so that's just something that immediately comes to mind.
I think what keeps us going, I think, is hope at large. And then is speaking to people about this or seeing how it affects people. It's the hope that art can do more than a history book. It could do more than a film. And it could do more than a state, I guess. It's proved it in a way. Being in Venice or in Bulgaria and being in the pavilion, sometimes we'll just be there pretending that we're visitors. Like I would love to pretend I'm a visitor. I'll just sit somewhere. And I think I'm inviting people to sit if they see someone sitting. But I mainly observe people. I would love to observe how they react or how they move through a space. That would give me a lot of hope. The amounts of people that came, how many people came?
It was something like 60,000.
6,000 people that came. the amounts of comments that people left, not comments on the media or like all of these articles we shared, but the fact that we left these books, like really simple notebooks for comments from the audience, and there were like 6 that got filled in, and people just wrote their stories. These books were positioned on a table without a chair, without any kind of a comfortable space to be interviewed, without the circumstances to share the story, and yet there was so much need to share the story that people wrote like sometimes 2-3 pages of everything they knew about their grandfather. And often it wasn't people that were from Bulgaria that wrote this in Bulgarian. It was people from all around the world that wrote the story of living with silence, or living with the silenced memory that you would never know where it came from, or like what it entailed as a whole.
And I think that's something that we weren't necessarily prepared to see. Just reading a letter that somebody wrote about their grandmother's apartment in India who had lived through the partition, or reading, somebody coming forward and telling us about their family in Mongolia or in Chile. There were these things that would kind of just come through the surface, and that's what I think maybe affirmed this, what sometimes felt like a little bit of a mystifying impulse to center domesticity and the domestic realm as a space that is quite charged with meaning. And it turned out that even if the objects might be more directly recognizable to like a Romanian person than somebody from Chile, there was something about the intense layered situatedness of the domestic realm that seemed to just be kind of quite viscerally communicative.
And I'll just add, and we'll finish, I promise. I think going back to this question, and how do we work through the difficulties of being in a space where the space could feel hostile, which is very true. The space feels hostile. It is sometimes hostile. It takes time to make a space for you or for this project. Initially, when we started doing this as like publicly in 2022 as a show, it had like really good criticism, it had really good reception, but it also had a lot of people being angry about this project. And I think Julian kind of touched on that. When we've spoken about this in conferences, even as an idea or as like a product of this in Bulgaria again, people were again angry. When we did a talk in Varna presenting this project after the Biennale had just opened, people were again, there were people in the audience that were really, you would see through their body language that they would be triggered by us speaking about this project. And every single time when that happened, actually, it was always someone that just had carried this traumatic memory, that had never had space to heal, that had to potentially acknowledge this and face it in a public space, in an artist's talk where they ended up going. And I think it's these wild encounters of witnessing that, being attacked about the project, but later understanding that actually this person is just hurt. And often I think when we do talks about Bulgaria, about this project, what happens is that the Q&A is actually us being asked to change the legal system, to rewrite history, and whether we'll start the case, like we will punish the perpetrators now. So I think that also gives a lot of context for why this should be done and why healing is important, right? Like if you expect an art project to change the legislation system of a country, then surely there's a lot of other work that needs to be done around.
I think what is also very important about the project as well, that's indeed how you mentioned that people actually, without even referring to a particular context of Bulgaria, and that's I think what you achieved as well in the pavilion, and that's why also I think project had a place in Venice, that you achieved that effectual way of showing something that's unshowable in a way, and showing it through this constellation that you've created that triggered and further trying to sort of nail down the term that we don't yet have, basically, for that amalgamation of both nostalgia, repulsion, and the sometimes paradoxically contradictory feelings that are referred to the silent history in that way. And yeah, for that you deserve more than a round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We are still staying here. We have bar open right now, and feel free to ask the questions that